Check.
Yeah, just testing the audio. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, sir.
Okay. Start the video. I'll go to a more.
Requesting everyone to please be seated. We will be starting in a few minutes. Thank you.
Hello, check. Check 1, 2. Hello, check. Check 1. Hello. Hello, check. Check 1. Hello. Hello, check. Hello. Hello, check. Check 1, 2. 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 Hello, check. Check. Hello. Hello, check. Check 1. Hello. Hello, check. Check 1. Hello, check. Check 1, 2. Hello, check. Check 1. Hello, check. Check 1, 2. Hello, check.
Good evening, everyone. I extend a very warm welcome to all who have joined us for the seminar on multilateral institutions for the 21st century, which is being organized by Department of Economic Affairs, Ministry of Finance, in association with Center for Social and Economic Progress, CSEP, and Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations, ICRIAR. Today's seminar is structured around two panel discussions. The first panel discussion is on the topic reforming international financial institutions, and the second panel discussion is on managing global debt vulnerabilities. Before we start the session, would request all to kindly keep your mobile phones on silent mode. Thank you. May I now invite on stage respected Vice Chairman NITI Aayog, Mr. Suman Bery, and Secretary, Department of Economic Affairs, Mr. Ajay Seth, for the inaugural session. May I now invite on stage Secretary, Department of Economic Affairs, Mr. Ajay Seth, for his opening remarks. Sir.
Respected Vice Chairman of NITI Aayog, Mr. Suman Bery, Mr. N.K. Singh, Co-Convenor of the G20 Independent Expert Group on Strengthening MDBs, who is joining us virtually today, distinguished panelists and participants who have joined in person and virtually, a very good afternoon. I welcome you all to this seminar on multilateral institutions for the 21st century, organized by Department of Economic Affairs, Ministry of Finance, in collaboration with ICRIA and Center for Social and Economic Progress. The G20 Summit and the unanimous adoption of the New Delhi Leaders' Declaration demonstrated two key aspects. First, the willingness of the global community to come together and work on issues of global importance despite deep divisions on geopolitical matters. Second, India's ability to build consensus in a key global forum. Both these developments bode well for multilateralism in general and the G20 in particular, and it is imperative that the momentum is maintained. The policy guideline or the policy guidance emerging from the New Delhi Leaders' Declaration requires engagement across multiple G20 presidencies and in various multilateral forums so as to bring it to fruition. We need to discuss and develop strategies to help us achieve this goal, and today's seminar has been organized with this objective. The issues under discussion today, that is reforming international financial institutions and managing debt vulnerabilities, are both multi-year in nature and occupy a prime place in global policy conversations today. Escalating global debt has been putting significant pressure on a number of low-income and middle-income countries. This is having repercussions on the ability of these countries to invest in improving their development outcomes. The past gains in poverty reduction and human development are reversing. The unmet financing needs for the sustainable development goals are ballooning, while the global challenges such as those arising from climate change and pandemics are growing in urgency, scale and complexity. Reforming international financial institutions becomes critical in this context. These reforms cannot focus on just financial aspect of the IFIs, but need to be more comprehensive to include the mandate, the governance frameworks, and operational elements of the international financial institutions. I look forward to a very productive discussion on these issues in today's seminar. Following the keynote address by Vice Chairman of NITI Aayog, we have two panel discussions. The first panel will focus on reforming international financial institutions, on reforming those institutions, and the second panel on managing global debt vulnerabilities. The panelists are highly distinguished in their respective fields and can provide valuable perspective on the issues under discussion. We thank each one of them for accepting our invitation to participate. Let me stop here and invite Vice Chairman NITI Aayog, Mr. Suman Bery, to deliver the keynote address. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Secretary, and let me thank CSEP and ICRIA for this invitation. It's a particular pleasure for me because through the whole G20 process, the Finance Ministry, which as you know leads the finance track, has been extremely open and consultative with me personally and with NITI Aayog. And so it is a pleasure to be able to return the favor. And I should acknowledge that much of this has come from my colleague in the Council of Ministers, the Honourable Finance Minister. Now, you were asked to turn your phones off. Let me tell you that I won't be offended if occasionally you take a peek to see what the score is, because I'm sure that I'm not effective competition against what's going on in Bombay. Now, Finance Secretary referred indifferently between the IFIs and the MDBs, and we are going to have a whole session on MDB reform, where N.K. Singh and those, Vera Songwe, others involved with the IEG, the expert group, will be talking about that. But here, because of my position at NITI Aayog and also as something of a student of the G20 from before I came to this job in government, I'd like to focus on both some of the broader achievements of the Indian presidency and also the point that Secretary made about the need to take this discussion forward. So I had the privilege of representing India at the SDG summit as a ministerial representative convened by the Secretary General at the time of the General Assembly, and there was wide admiration for what India had pulled off in its G20 presidency. And why was there that admiration? Because there was a kind of despair, actually, about the ability to make progress on issues facing the world because of the polarization, the geopolitical polarization. So to those involved, particularly Secretary of Economic Affairs, the Sherpa people who are here from the G20 Secretariat, my compliments to all of you for a job extremely well done. But I think also we must not lose sight of the fact that one of the things, and this is particularly important for me at NITI Aayog, one of the important achievements of the New Delhi Leaders' Declaration was to bring the Sustainable Development Goals back to the center of the global compact, if you will. And I say that this was important because the whole way we think about global public goods has been broadened by this formulation in the New Delhi Leaders' Declaration, and a step away from the single-minded focus on mitigation as being the only global dimension, only global challenge that the global community had to face. So I think bringing the SDGs to the heart of the development debate, indeed bringing development to the heart of the G20, not just macro coordination, was a huge achievement of India's G20 presidency. But I do want to make two other points. The first is that MDB reform of the multilateral development banks, is incomplete without similar reform of the global monetary order with the International Monetary Fund at its center. Now, it's important that one of the panelists is in the second session, is Anup Singh, who's here with CSEP. And Anup has, in a recent contribution in Mint, together with Michel Camdessus, brought the urgency of global monetary reform back onto the table. And I think rightly so, for several reasons. They're in the article, but let me give you a more India-specific perspective on this. India, since the Asian financial crisis, has run its macro economy essentially to make sure that our current account deficit, is around 2% of GDP, and B, that we self-insure through the build-up of reserves. Now, this is not the ideal configuration for what India needs to achieve as we go for Viksit Bharat. We're going to have to increase our investment rate. We are going to want to attract more global finance. And as I said at the Kautilya Enclave last year, at the time that Korea, etc., were in their fast growth phase, they were sustaining current account deficits of 5, 6, 7%. I'm not recommending that for India, but we are in a global financial environment that discourages that kind of risk-taking. Second, and this came up at the India Policy Forum in the speech given by Ellen Ray of the London Business School, we are in a global financial cycle which is characterized by risk on, risk off. And frankly, we are not in a world where global finance is supportive of the long-term goals that the globe has subscribed to. And so I do think that reform of the international monetary order is something that needs to come back to the center stage. And you may recall that at the time of the landmark 2009 London summit, Gordon Brown talked of the need for a new Bretton Woods. And, to some extent, the moment for that might be now, but in a different form. And my final point, and this was stimulated by a conference that NITI organized at the end of July, an international conference. It is the job of, as it were, the bureaucracy to make progress where they can. And as I say, I think our bureaucrats have done a splendid job. But if we are the size of economy, we see ourselves as the same size of economy as that of, say, the UK or Germany, then our intellectuals should be contributing to a global debate on international monetary reform. And let me just say, the core issue in all of this is how do you get incumbents to give up entrenched power? I remember when I wrote a paper for Bruegel and talked to Jean-Claude Trichet, he was absolutely clear that what needed to happen on the fund board was one Eurozone seat instead of the dispersion of votes across national chairs. But up till now, the EU has not been able to persuade member states to give that up. And so it is going to be a long process. I think it's admirable that under the present dispensation, the finance ministry has encouraged transparency and debate. Secretary, thank you for allowing me to be part of this. And we must now all prepare for how we hand over to Brazil and make sure that the momentum that you've generated can be taken forward, not only by the ministry, but by many of those in this room. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. Would request Secretary and VC NITI Aayog to kindly take seat in the front row. Please, sir. We will now move on to the first panel discussion on reforming international financial institutions. This panel will be a virtual panel. We have joined with us virtually co-convenor G20 Independent Expert Group on Strengthening MDBs, Mr. N.K. Singh, who will be the moderator for this session. Mr. N.K. Singh is a prominent Indian economist, academician, and policymaker. He is currently chairman of the 15th Finance Commission. Prior to this position, he presided as chairman of the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Review Committee. He also served as a member of the upper house of the parliament, the Rajya Sabha, from 2008 to 2014, during which time he contributed to several prominent parliamentary standing committees, including the Public Accounts Committee, the Committee on Foreign Affairs, and the Committee on Human Resource Development. I would also like to welcome for this session our esteemed panelist. Please welcome member G20 Independent Expert Group on Strengthening MDBs, Dr. Vera Songwe, who is joining us virtually. Chief Economic Advisor, Government of India, Dr. V. Anantha Nageshwaran, who is joining us virtually. Senior Resident Representative, IMF, Mr. Louis Brewer, who is joining us virtually. Thank you all for joining us. May I now request co-convenor G20 Independent Expert Group, Mr. N.K. Singh, sir, to kindly take forward the panel discussion. Sir, the floor is yours.
Yes. Am I audible?
Yes, sir, you are.
Oh, all right. Well, at the very outset, let me express my gratitude to the Department of Economic Affairs and the others who have cooperated in convening this important panel discussion on reforming the international financial institutions. I will pose some questions and some issues for the three very distinguished panelists who are with us, all virtually present, one of whom, of course, Vera was a core member of the IEG, of which I had the privilege of being the co-convenor, along with Professor Lawrence Summers. And of course, the chief economic advisor, while not being a formal member, for all practical purposes, greatly guided and facilitated the two reports which we were privileged to submit to the presidency. Now, of course, the IMF representative, Mr. Bery, has been a keen follower of these issues and has really tracked all the developments in this area very keenly, not only during the current presidency, but I know with my past association with him that he has been tracking India's economic developments in a global context for much longer. So welcome to all the three very distinguished panelists. I'll make a couple of very broad observations. First, I think that I agree with Suman Bery from the Vice Chairman of NITI Aayog that there is general appreciation of the role that India has played during its G20 presidency. And one of the core areas, apart from the success in the New Delhi Declaration, which has been applauded all over. There are several areas where there have been very distinct progress. One area is that much before India had assumed the presidency of the G20, is that the Indian leadership, the Prime Minister had spoken repeatedly about the need to reform the multilateral financial institutions. And I think that apart from this, it was therefore no surprise that when India assumed the presidency of the G20, then on the finance track, they appointed an independent expert group of which both Professor Lawrence Summers and I have been privileged to be the co-conveners, with a very distinguished set of panelists, of which Veera was a core panelist with our group. We followed the rather rigorous terms of reference and presented our report in 2 volumes. We were greatly supported in our effort by a good core team, and the important secretarial support and intellectual support came to us from 2 organizations, the ICRIA under the leadership of Dr. Deepak Mishra, and the Center for Global Development under the leadership of Mr. Masood Ahmed. And we were also supported by a number of others who were keenly involved in this process. We presented 2 reports. The first report was resulted in the reference to this in the Delhi Declaration, which is before us, and recognized really the importance of this subject and reiterated the need to really, going forward, to have a multilateral development institution which was fit for the 21st century. We followed our first report, which we called the triple report, triple in terms of mandate, triple in terms of its financing reach, triple in terms of the financing mechanism. And that's why we called it the triple report. We followed this up by a second report, which we presented to the G20 in Marrakesh. And we were really greatly privileged that the G20 welcomed our report in the Marrakesh G20 communique. And almost every component of the report which we had presented got attraction, which was really very, very heartening. So these reports are in front of all of us. The panelists are well aware of this. I wish to raise only 3 questions to the panelists. First, as rightly pointed out by Secretary Economic Affairs, who has, of course, played a very key role, he and his team, in facilitating the work of the independent expert group, and who has taken a great deal of personal interest in the meeting of the deputies right from the inception of our G20 presidency. And he has today very rightly pointed out that it is necessary to take on the principle of the fact that our G20 presidency would end very soon, the need to take these recommendations forward. So I want to focus on what more is necessary for ensuring that the focus remains on the implementation of the 30 recommendations which we made in volume 2 of our report. Each of these 30s are fairly granular. There are quite a few of them quantitative targets. They have a time frame in it. And I was greatly heartened that when I met the heads of the multilateral development banks in Marrakesh and with the president of the World Bank, that they had taken very keen note of this and were constituting working groups on each of these recommendations which we have made. But I think that how do we take these recommendations forward so that the aims and objectives and the achievable monitorable targets are really achieved in a manner where we do not lose focus of this very important change which the G20 had fully endorsed in the New Delhi Declaration. And what does therefore this imply for a country like India? How does a stronger multilateral development system and multilateral development banks be of benefit to a large middle income country like India is the first area. And how will the countries of the global south be benefited from a strengthened IFI? And what is the kind of direction in which we should take the further dialogue? How really can we really keep the focus active within the core countries? I must mention that very recently, I returned last week after participating in a special meeting which President Emmanuel Macron had convened along with where the others, some of the other important G7 countries were present, and where also we received this report was very favorably considered, and they want to be very actively engaged in its further discussions. This is going to be further considered in the context of COP28, which is now around the corner, and where Veera has a very important role to play because she is the co-chairman of the group on climate financing, the core agenda of the COP28. So these are different strands. So the one very broad issue on which I would really request this very distinguished panel to focus on is really some of the issues which I have mentioned, the importance and relevance of this for a country like India, for the global south, and of course, how does one keep really the focus on the reform of the multilateral development banks as contained in our two-volume report and as indicated in the New Delhi Declaration and embedded in the Marrakesh communique which was issued. So this is the broad context in which we are discussing of how do we carry forward the great significant achievements which has been lauded all over, and what more can we do to invest mechanisms, processes, and systems so that the focus on this over multiple presidencies, as Secretary Economic Affairs very rightly pointed out in his opening observations, is we keep honed in very important issue. So with these opening observations, can I first request the first panelist, Mr. V. Anantha Nageshwaram, the Chief Economic Advisor, to make his comments and observations. Over to you.
Thank you, sir. Good evening, everybody. I hope you can hear me well. Sir, what is the time allotted to me, sir? I would like to hear from the moderator, sir. What is the time allotted for the speaker?
So can I say 12 minutes?
Oh, that's quite a lot. I think I'll probably hand you back some surplus to
Thank you.
reallocate among other panelists.
Thank you.
So
because we will have also a Q&A, hopefully.
yeah.
Thank you.
Before we begin the remarks proper, the vice chairman of NITI Aayog said that he was no competition to what is going on elsewhere in India, in Mumbai. And in case some of the panelists and other members of the audience were curious to know, Mr. Virat Kohli completed his 50th one-day century, overtaking Mr. Sachin Tendulkar's record of 4900s. And with that important milestone out of the way, we can now concentrate on somewhat less important issues such as reforming multilateral institutions and international financial architecture. The G20 New Delhi Leaders Declaration, among many other far-reaching ideas and suggestions achieved with extraordinary consensus in a polarized environment, also took cognizance of the need for reforming the international institutional architecture, of which multilateral financing institutions were an important part. The declaration underscored the need for enhancing representation and voice of developing countries in the decision-making process in international economic and financial institutions to make them more effective, credible, and accountable. This, of course, was vital to build a more inclusive and reinvigorated multilateralism which the G20 leaders aspire for. And it is in this regard the independent expert group constituted by the Indian G20 presidency played a very important part. And already the chairperson of this session, Shri N.K. Singh, the co-convener, has already shared with you some important dimensions and content of these two-volume reports. And the reports are already available in public domain. It has been brought out in two volumes, and both the volumes together present very comprehensive set of recommendations on the changes needed in the global development financing landscape and the role of MDBs. It is also an opportunity. It was very generous of the chairperson, Mr. N.K. Singh, to say that I was unofficially part of the overall deliberations of the IEG and contributed to it. It was very generous of him. But of course, all credit indeed must go to the co-conveners and other members helped by the consulting organizations, ICRIER and CGD and scores of others. So in that sense, all credit and all gratefulness from our side to them. So I would like to use this opportunity to congratulate the co-conveners and other members for their tremendous contribution, because this report in two volumes has made an important difference to the deliverables under the finance track of the G20 presidency. The reports in both the volumes aim for transformation rather than incremental change in the functioning of multilateral development banks, principally the World Bank. And it provides a well-calibrated roadmap to facilitate that transformation. Second, these reports look at the roles of the multilateral development banks, their financing capacity and effectiveness as a system, rather than looking at them as individual institutions. In other words, there is much to be gained by these banks working together as a system of multilateral development banks rather than as individual institutions. Third, the report in its entirety takes a holistic and unbiased approach to the issue of enhancing the financial resources of multilateral development banks. It acknowledges the need to use existing resources more effectively. In other words, the current discussions surrounding enhancing the capital adequacy framework is acknowledged, and the role and the enhancement it can contribute is acknowledged in the report. At the same time, the report goes beyond capital adequacy framework and balance sheet optimization, because the funding requirements in this world to take care of both development needs and global development and global public challenges are humongous. And therefore, tinkering at the margin will definitely be needed, an essential part of the overall gamut of solutions, but cannot be the sole answer. So towards that end, the reports look at hybrid capital, donor capital, concessional finance, the multilateral development institutions facilitating private capital, and also voluntary contributions even by shareholders which do not disturb the current shareholding structure, etc. So the report leaves no stone unturned in harnessing or pointing the way out for these institutions to look at various sources of funding. At the same time, in deference to the wishes of the shareholders and G20 members, the report acknowledges the fact that bigger banks are probably only second in importance to better banks. So given the fact that many of the members of the IEG were formerly associated with the World Bank or any other regional development bank in some capacity or the other, along with the consulting organizations, the reports dwell deeper into the internal organizational changes that are needed for these banks to become more effective and bolder as well. But let us not forget that the theme of today's session is international financial institutions and not just multilateral development banks. And in this regard, I would like to point out that IMF reforms were also emphasized in the New Delhi Leaders' Declaration. The leaders remain committed to revisiting the adequacy of quotas, and to continuing the process of IMF governance reform under the 16th General Review of Quotas. I'm happy to note that the political impetus from the G20 has indeed carried forward into the IMF discussions. The executive board of the IMF has proposed to the Board of Governors a 50% quota increase allocated to members in proportion to their current quotas, equi-proportional distribution of a 50% quota increase. This quota increase can play a pivotal role in safeguarding global financial stability by enhancing the IMF permanent resources and reducing its reliance on borrowed resources. In other words, reform of international financial institutions has to go beyond the World Bank and the system of MDBs into IMF. In the remaining time, I will take a small share of it, as I promised the chairperson of the session that I will hand him back a few minutes. I want to focus a bit on the voice and representation aspect, without which these reforms will be incomplete, and that should be on the future reform agenda of subsequent G20 presidencies. The second element in making the multilateral banking system work effectively, apart from the MDBs harnessing resources so that they can lend to countries, their borrowing countries for development purposes and to meet the global challenges, some of these elements may be beyond their control. After all, development takes two sides to tango. One is funding and also the effective deployment of funding, domestic policies, etc. Similarly, global public challenges such as climate change and global warming, transition to sustainable forms of energy, etc., depend on technology, depend on availability of critical minerals and rare earths, and also many other dimensions which may be outside the purview of international financial institutions. Therefore, when it comes to change, as everybody has said, if you want to change the world, the change must begin from within. Therefore, each one of us, individuals or institutions, must focus on what is it that we can change. And the World Bank, of all multilateral development banks, has something called the World Governance Index, which unfortunately or fortunately plays a very significant part in opaque and non-transparent ways in the credit rating assessment deployed by the three credit rating agencies in assigning letter grades to credit rating of member countries, particularly emerging markets. This World Governance Index in itself is a composite of several sub-indices which are purely based on the subjective opinions of some so-called expert institutions, which do not have presence on the ground, nor do they understand whether the context in which they are making these judgments is appropriate or apt for the member countries. But these indices become important part of the assessment methodology of the credit rating agencies, and they do not reveal the extent to which these indices are implanted in their assessment process, the weights they carry, because there seems to be qualitative overlays on top of qualitative assessments. It's almost like subprime squared, subprime cubed, which we experienced in 2007-2008. So in other words, the easiest way in which multilateral development banking system can help their member countries to access capital for global challenges and development needs is to ensure that their World Governance Index is transparent, less subjective and less arbitrary, more suited to the context, involves participation of developing countries, and also make sure that its limitations are very well understood by the credit rating agencies. When we talk of voice and representation must start with the sub-indices created by expert institutions that go into the World Governance Index. So in other words, this is one eminent change which do not require the consent of shareholders, but the management of the World Bank can do it by itself to lend a practical weight to voice and representation by starting to reform the World Governance Index, in turn helping many emerging economies be assessed objectively by credit rating agencies. If their credit rating improves, or at the minimum stops being downgraded, the amount of financing costs it will save for them in the global capital markets will run into billions of dollars, which can be then spent on development needs and global public goods as well. So, in other words, the most important reform of international financial institutions probably is not something that is related to shareholding rights, shareholding weights, or internal governance, etc., but in an area which is need for greater transparency and less opacity, and it starts with the World Governance Index. With those remarks, I apologize to the chairperson for not being able to give him
WebEx
comments.
Assistant is
First,
enabled
I
to save
think
audio
that
highlights.
Anant, you have introduced a new kind of philosophy and a recommendation, which incidentally, Veera would be appropriately placed to comment on it, namely that one of our core recommendations is how to harness private capital. And one of the areas where private capital, apart from the issues of risk mitigation and balancing, would be on where does the country figure in the global governance index. And that's an aspect, perhaps, which, as you say, is endogenous to the multilateral development banks and the family. It's not dependent on the structure of the shareholding or anything of that kind, but would be also an important pointer in a direction where private capital would find it more useful. Veera, floor is yours to comment on this and also to comment on the issue of the area where you are working very intensively right now on the broader area of climate financing, where you have played a key role, but you may wish to have a comment or observation on some of the issues which are posed, and this important issue that the Chief Economic Advisor has posed on the Global Governance Index in the broader context of harnessing private capital. Veera, over to you.
Thank you again, Chairperson. And it was a pleasure to be a part of your commission and to work with you on this. And it's an honor to be with this discussion today. Let me start again by thanking and re-emphasizing the role that the Minister of Finance of India played, I think, in even sort of deciding to put together this commission, because I think it would have taken an emerging market economy to say, you know, we need to focus on the global financial architecture, and I think no better than India to do it, and no better than a woman to do it as well, because it is important. We're talking here about development and growth, and it is an important part of the agenda. So I want to congratulate the G20 of India for really making this key and cornerstone of the conversations. Of course, we saw the Prime Minister in his visit to the United States with President Biden put this on the agenda, and I think really make it a focus of all the conversations that he was having, and I think that gave it the kind of importance that it deserved and needed. When we talk about reform of the global financial architecture, sometimes it's very easy to think about it in the abstract, but we are talking about, you know, resources that will go to about 4.2 billion people in the world to help them develop. So this is what we're talking about when we talk about reform of the global financial architecture. As you said, Chairperson, in the beginning, we did two reports. We did one report, which essentially was the triple agenda, was to put climate change in the sort of development space as a central part of the development agenda, to increase financing to multilateral development banks, and to modernize the funding models that we had. That was the first report. The second report, again, was a triple agenda, but this time called Bigger, Bolder, and Better, which was essentially looking at how we can improve and strengthen MDBs and make the MDBs work better as a system together, realizing that the MDBs can only raise the kind of resources that are needed if they work as a system together. For better, we actually meant converting the operating model to support transformational investments, not just sort of a lot of, for many of you that have been working on and with MDBs, we have very small pilot projects, but this was about, how can we do transformational investments like, the Namtoom project, or the power projects that have been happening in India in some of the states. Bolder was to put the private sector at the center, and this is what, Chairman, you talked about, and I will come to that in a minute. And finally, bigger was scaling up the financing and getting financing at affordable cost. These two things link very nicely with what the Chief Anand said, and very important, this governance issue. There is no emerging market economy today that is rated AAA or even AA. So essentially, this means that your access to markets, or the cost of accessing markets, become quite expensive. And the way I like to put it is that actually the developed countries who access markets at 200 basis points are getting concessional financing. All of this conversation that we're having is about access to concessional financing. And the developed countries have access to markets at 200 basis points concessional financing, whereas the emerging market economies, we are put under either high yield or frontier market economies. And so access to markets at 600 to 800 basis points. And today we have about 24 countries, according to IMF statistics, that are accessing markets at 700 to 900 basis points, and 12 and above 900 basis points. This essentially means that the risk-adjusted rate of return for any project in a country like that has to be extremely high for the investment to actually happen. And so essentially the biggest part and the biggest problem for development is really, in India, I must celebrate, is growing at 6%, but India needs to grow at 10%. So does Africa. And as part of the India G20, of course, there was the big, and again, celebrating the work that the chief minister has done, and the chief economist and secretary, as well as, of course, adding Africa into the G20. Now we have the G21. I think makes this an even more important point, is how can we get access to cheaper financing? And yes, concessional financing is important because we blend, and we all talk about how we do blending. You want to blend concessional financing with market financing to be able to do development. But it's very difficult to blend concessional financing with market financing if market financing is exorbitantly high. And market financing is high because, exactly as Anand said, there is the rating agencies which assess your ability to pay for your debt. And that's what they do. But if the framework within which they make those assessments is not sufficiently transparent, it becomes quite difficult to do that. And then we have, on top of that, of course, issues around FX risk and how we manage FX risk, and can we move a little bit into working more with local capital and local currency, so that the same kind of energy plant that is built in India does not cost more in investment terms than the same energy plant that is done in Spain or Italy. I think these are the issues that we want to sort of reform in the global financial architecture, is to say that the cost of capital needs to reflect the real risk of investments in emerging markets, so that we can actually catch up. What do we need to do that? We need to provide guarantees. I think we have seen in the United States, for example, or in Europe, the experience of guarantees as a way of leveraging investments has been quite powerful. And a lot of what was done during the crisis, actually, in the United States, was using guarantees to make sure that a lot of the private sector could continue to function and could secure its debt. What we are proposing is in the MIGA, which is the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, the guarantee part of the World Bank, for example, that we are able to increase the guarantee potential and the guarantee firepower of MIGA so that MIGA can use those guarantees a lot more effectively. But not only just using the guarantees, and this is, I think, the important part of our report, is also that the MDBs together can work as a team so that you can actually share and transfer guarantees in a way that, if one country needed, one institution needed guarantees more than the other, that we could actually work together to share those guarantees. The other thing is about how we do blended financing and what you need to blend, how we do project development, where we can bring in, a lower end of concessional money to help develop projects so that then eventually the private sector can come in and make sure that those projects are developed and are executed and implemented in a more effective way. This will require a couple of things. It's one, co-creation of some of these projects with the private sector and having a much more private sector focus. Right now, in many of the multilateral development institutions, resources are used one for one, which essentially means we don't leverage, we don't mobilize additional capital. When we get it, we use $1 of infrastructure to produce $1 of an energy plant, whereas we can actually use the $1 of concessional financing from an MDB to raise $4 of private sector capital that can then be mobilized to do the investments. And I think the India B20, the business forum, was able to bring out some of these kinds of ways in which we can use the private sector in a very, very effective way. And we hope that our report was able to bring that out as well, to show that there are different ways of using capital. But the issue around all of the questions on reforming the international finance institutions are really about growth. I want to go back to that because we tend to talk a lot about the debt part. We tend to talk a lot about the accessing finance part. But at the end of the day, it's about how we organize the systems to deliver growth. And this is where we need better systems. Is we need the MDBs to be able to accompany countries with their country development plans. How can you now include the climate element into your growth plans? How can you make sure that you're also assessing and taking into account the need? We say in our other report that we need $2.4 trillion to meet the climate challenges of the future. But it's going to take a different way of assessing risk. It's going to take a different way of doing the growth plans. It's going to take a different way of saying how you do the transitions. And I think this is an important part of saying, yes, growth is going to be green. Yes, growth is going to be digital. Yes, growth is going to be youthful for Africa and for India especially. But how do you make those plans sustainable enough and robust enough so that the financing that we can raise then begins to deliver on the kind of transformational growth that we need? And I think this sort of having the MDBs work together in a more coherent fashion, but more importantly, and I think Annette was talking about that, the governance of how they work together is also very important. And unpacking that governance system is something that we hope that going forward, the Brazilian G20 and of course the South African G20 can take into account and monitor the recommendations we have put in the report to make sure that climate is not a risk, but it is really a source of growth for the future, and that we have more effective multilateral development systems. Thank you. I hope I gave you minutes back.
Yes, thank you very much. We seem to be trading minutes, but anyway, thank you very much. And thank you for addressing some of the issues which I had posed and some of the issues which are germane to our report. I think the issue of a more transparent framework on the governance index, which was posed by the chief economic advisor, would need to be more coherently addressed. But before I return to that, can I give the floor now to Louis Brenner, who has, of course, Louis has taken a keen interest in all this. He has heard our discussions today. He can choose to address any of the issues we have addressed, but particularly, can I request you to address the issue that from the vantage point of the International Monetary Fund, and I think that the deputy chairman of the NITI Aayog alluded to the need for both the multilateral development banks and the International Monetary Fund to really act in symmetry to bring about transformative changes. That's one area where you are very well positioned to make some observations on that. But apart from that, some of the issues that you have heard, floor is yours. Louis?
Thank you very much, Mr. N.K. Singh. Am I audible?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, wonderful. And thank you very much to the Ministry of Finance and CISA for the invitation to this very distinguished panel, which is an honor for me. And as others, congratulations to India for a very successful G20 at a time where geopolitical tensions make international cooperation very challenging. And not only in reflected in the leaders' declaration, which was quite a remarkable achievement, but the reference by the chief economic advisor, Dr. Nash, of the executive board of the IMF's decision to propose a 50% increase in the quota, proportional increase to its governors, I believe was a direct result of that consensus that India was able to forge in the G20 platform, as well as the indirect effect, if I can say so, of the expert group's recommendations. One of the big challenges that countries and policymakers face today all over the world is how to keep up with a very rapidly changing economy, society, and so forth. Whether it's because of technological dissemination, demographic changes, changes in tastes and preferences, countries' economies change very quickly and institutions tend to move slower. And I think one can think of that asymmetry also at the international level and with international organizations. So I think that the contribution of the expert group by bringing the issue to the radar screen of top policymakers and proposing a roadmap is very, very important. And certainly an institution like the IMF would welcome this. Now, the IMF has tried to adapt to a changing world. And after the capital account crises of the 90s, which started in Mexico and Argentina and then propagated to Asia, Russia, and so forth, the IMF underwent a period of rapid change. Now, what we hear from the expert group and others is that this is not enough. More needs to be done. And I think that there is an emerging international political consensus that this is the direction to take. Now, what is our point of departure? Especially the Asian financial crisis was a big event for the whole world, including for the internal operations of the IMF. The IMF initiated a process of change after that that continues to this day. And let me just focus on two or three very briefly that are related to the topic we're talking about today. One is on the governance. The CA already mentioned the recent decision of the board on quotas, but also the IMF has been trying to increase its representation, including of emerging markets. And this is a conversation that has been ongoing with some partial success a few years ago and will continue to as the board is being prepared to look at different approaches to realign quotas, which is a measure of representation, by 2025. The fund has also increased its attention on the economic outcomes in less developed countries by developing a whole framework of working coming up with new facilities like the PRGT, started in the early 2000s with two large debt relief processes called the HIPIC and the analytical work, including, for example, in a recent publication, a flagship publication called the Global Financial Stability Report, that a chapter is dedicated on policies and actions to promote private capital to emerging and developing countries to address climate change um, challenges. It has incorporated the issue of climate change in its day-to-day operations, in its annual health checkup of economies, which we call surveillance, in its in-depth studies of financial sectors that we call FSAPs, which, by the way, India will uh, undergo next year, and recently come up with a lending window called the RST that for the first time in the IMF history is a long-term lending facility to address structural and heavy challenges like climate change, pandemic preparedness, and so forth for countries. Now, this facility or lending window is quite innovative in IMF tradition, but we must recognize it's very small. Right now, the funds it has been able to garner are about $40 billion, which is a drop of water in this desert of financing needs to address some of the big global challenges. But the fund can support the effort of other multilateral institutions by not only channeling resources, which are limited, but by promoting policy reforms that would make countries more attractive for both public and private finance to address these issues. And some of the ideas of the expert group, such as the further channeling of special drawing rights, the IMF, I don't want to call it currency, but the IMF instrument to the RST to finance needed investments in the long run to address climate change and other are very important in garnering that political consensus that can then lead to decisions by the main systemic countries that would actually move the needle in this area. So going back to the chairman's or co-chairman's question at the beginning, or actually two questions. One is on how to keep this conversation going. Well, I think the answer there is quite simple. The conversation was triggered by Indian leadership in the G20, and the G20 is not going away. It will continue next year under the presidency of Brazil. And so that is a natural forum to continue the conversation, in addition to the executive boards of the IMF and other international organizations that um, have a role in this issue. On the issue of the reform of the international monetary system, I think a critical element there is a reform of the governance of institutions such as the IMF. And reforming the governance has many dimensions. One is the quota system, the liquidity that the IMF can tap into uh, to address systemic or large crises in emerging markets. And there has been some progress in that regard. Now, the issue of emerging market representation, for example, at the board and in the quota system of the IMF, is an issue that is still quite open. And while there has been some progress, particularly in 2016, when the quotas were realigned to give more space to large emerging countries such as India and others, that was quite frankly a initial step. There's much more that needs to be done. And this is the work in progress that, as you can well imagine, will require the consensus of the countries involved in the board of the IMF. And India can play a big leadership role in garnering that consensus. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Luis, for those remarks. Also, thank you for sharing with us your own perspective on the reform of the International Fund. Yes, indeed, the success in being able to significantly enhance the quotas during this period without upsetting the issues of governance has been an important achievement. And the managing director of the fund, with whom I had the pleasure of being on the same panel last week, did repeatedly mention that this was indeed a very, very significant achievement during the recent period. But I think that the broader issues of the reform of the International Monetary Fund, on which, Louis, you touched upon, is an issue on which much greater deliberation needs to be given. But we have some time left for questions and answers. If does anybody have any question, can raise the hand. The mic can go. If it's addressed to any of the panel, there is perhaps time for 2 questions or so before we give closing observation.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Nandan Roy. I am a final year political science honors student from the University of Delhi. My question is specifically to Louis, sir. Everyone else may also answer. Sir, we recently, our G20 presidency is about to end, and as not just the president of G20, but as a neighbor and a friend to Sri Lanka, my heart goes out to ask you this question, that Sri Lanka had been experiencing problems in its economy since 2021 roughly. In 2022, very beginning of it, the Ukraine war started. By 18th of March 2023, IMF was ready with a $15.6 billion loan to Ukraine. While it took us, the IMF, so long, it went till 28th of September when a $3 billion bailout was announced for the Sri Lankan economy. Sir, we talk of reforming international financial institutions, but we are clearly seeing that there's a Western bias. Sri Lankan economy is a good performer. I would just like to ask you that when we talk of reforming international financial institutions, when are we going to see a parity between the global north and the global south when it comes to the IMF? Thank you so much.
Louis would like to take that question, or shall we pool 1 or 2 more questions? Perhaps it may be prudent to pool at least 1 more, if not 2 more. Anyone else? I see none. So,
thank you very
Louis
much. My question is to the Chief Economic Advisor. He mentioned that MDBs should be working as a system rather than as individual banks. Sir, could you please elaborate on this a little bit more?
All right. Thank you. Perhaps there's not much time for more questions, but can I request first, Louis, to address the first question asked by Nandan before I request either Veera or Anant to respond to the second question. So, Louis, first to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Singh. Maybe I can explain the way the fund works. The fund has a lot of experience auditing economic policies. The fund does not make policies in countries. This is the prerogative, the responsibility of country authorities, and they have the mandate to do so. In the case of Sri Lanka, the fund had been raising the yellow lights on the unsustainability of the debt, both in private and in public. The fund does an annual health checkup of the economy called the Article 4, which produces a report that goes to the board and then is published. And that report of last year was very clear about the risks facing. Now, funding for a country requires a decision of the executive board based on the country's economic program, a commitment of a country to address the issues that led to the economic difficulties in the first place. So when these things came together, the IMF program was approved. Now, as part of an integral IMF policy, there is the um, mandate to treat all countries equally. Uniformity of treatment is very important in the fund, in the staff. Now, not all countries are alike, so you can't have a cookie cutter recipe for every situation, but the practice and the intention is to act as a public institution where everybody is treated in the same way. Thank you.
Thank you, Louis. I'm sure Nandan doesn't wish to pursue that question, to perhaps ask you of what was the degree of foresight and the quality of the Article 4 consultation. Is it that perhaps, since this is an annual thing, that the fund was able to spot incipient signs of pressure significantly earlier than when the event had taken place? And therefore, the issue of the quality of surveillance mechanism in the Article 4 consultations, I'm sure Nandan would not want to pursue that question, but I'll just leave that thought with you. As I turn to now Anand, of course, on the issue of MDBs working as a system, before I really request the Chief Economic Advisor for his comments, let me say that this is one of the core issues in our two reports. And when we talk of not only better, bolder, and bigger, on the better, one of the core issues on the better is how MDBs can act as a family in multiple ways, which we have outlined in our report, and really it's a classic case where the final outcome is much more than the sum of the parts, in multiple ways in which it can do so in their own governance structure and within the framework of their own shareholding and their accountability, is something which we have dealt with in significant detail in both report 1 and in terms of the recommendations on this specific point, which is contained in report 2. But since the question was addressed to you, Anand, over to you.
Sir, it would be presumptuous on my part to try and answer this question when you, the co-convener, and Bery, the member of the independent expert group, which addressed this very topic, is present on this occasion. And you, in fact, have already given a brilliant, lucid exposition of what it means for the MDBs to act as a system. Therefore, it will be almost impossible for me to go better than that. So I'm going to step back and ask the person who asked the question to reflect on your remarks, and also maybe Bery can add some more, and more importantly, to go through the volume 1 and volume 2 of the IEG report. I can't do better than that. Over to you.
Thank you. Veera would like to make a comment or two on this.
Just very quickly, I'll give 2 examples, and thank you for the question. Getting an echo. The first one will be, I think, again, on the country partnerships. The reports emphasize a lot the country partnerships, but one of the things that we see is that each MDB asks countries to do a climate plan. And so, countries have 14 climate plans for 14 MDBs. We are asking for the MDBs to come together and do one coordinated climate and growth strategy, for example. So that will be on the sort of better MDB system working together. On the financing, I gave the example of creating the guarantees platform so that countries can pool together each other's financial balance sheets to be able to service better global demands that are coming. A third example, so I've given you one example on the bigger, I've given you on the better, which is on country platforms, on the bigger, which is on how we pull together resources and leverage the guarantee system. And on the better is also how we work with the private sector collectively A lot of times what we see is one institution working with the private sector. For example, in the climate space, we've heard about the Ecuador bond and the Galapagos bond. Can we do a Galapagos bond across the global financial institution and not just have one in one institution that is done, but maybe share the expertise, the technical expertise, working with the private sector so we can do it better. So these are, I think, some of the ways in which the system can work together. Let's remember that the MDBs are managed by the same shareholders. And so essentially, we also want the shareholders to send the same messages to each of these institutions so we don't get different institutions saying different things at different times. There's been a question very quickly on the chat about the foreign exchange risk and how that can be managed. And since it's an important issue, let me just come to it very quickly. I think the first one is maybe, and the IMF is here, but the World Bank as well, and many more. Can we use more hedging instruments? And as systems, can we hedge better? There's been some initiatives about creating maybe a fund for FX risk. I think a lot more work needs to be done. We have the TCX out there that is doing some exchange risk management, but FX risk, when it is sort of in the middle of the curve, in the bell curve, for example, are normal. What we need, I think, MDBs to do is take care of the tail end risk. When you have 20% depreciations in currencies, then you do have an event, and I think that you need the MDBs to come in at that time. But the most important is to see how much more we can do in local currency, because that will take a lot of that FX risk away. And finally, on Landon's question, there is no doubt that today we don't yet have a good debt restructuring framework, whether it's for middle income countries or for low income countries. The G20 common framework is taking a very, very long time to sort of deliver the results. We only have, actually, Zambia has not yet concluded because the private creditors have a different agreement. The public creditors are not very happy. So we do need, I think no system, the private sector knows this, bankruptcy laws are the most important underpinning of a private sector system that works effectively. On the public sector sovereign side, we need debt restructuring systems that are effective. The IMF needs support to be able to build a G20 common framework that works. The fact that today we have a very desperate set of creditors, private sector creditors that are much larger now than public sector creditors, makes this conversation a little bit difficult. But I think it is in the interest of development, and the India G20 has put this at the fore, to find a way to sort of create a new debt restructuring framework that makes it faster. To begin with, we cannot get Zambia waiting 3 years to get a debt restructuring system to work, because by then there will be no growth. I think Sri Lanka was lucky, actually. You finally got something, maybe not as fast as others, but you did. But there is many more countries in 2024 that will need debt restructuring, because these tons of bullet payments coming due. And I think before we get to that point, we do need a global financial architecture that can resolve this problem in a much more speedy way.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Vera. We're coming to the close of this session. Let me make just two broad observations. First and foremost, let me say that I think that the reforms of the international financial system, which is the broad theme of this session, must inevitably be an ongoing process. The G20 presidency of India gave a huge impetus to what was a very slow trajectory in finding multiple ways where this can be accelerated and the system can be transformed to meet the important challenges of the 21st century, not only in terms of the two important reports, but in other multiple ways embedded in the Delhi Declaration. Some of these ideas have already gathered traction, and I think that the progress in the last 6 months has been a notable change in the pace at which these issues are being addressed earlier. Fortunately, ICRIA has done a checklist, and if it is all right by ICRIA, then I would really request that a copy of the progress already achieved could be made available to the Department of Economic Affairs to be shared in such manner as is considered appropriate. We need to keep a track. We need to keep a momentum going, because reforming the international financial architecture would continue to engage the attention of policymakers over multiple G20 presidencies. And I have no doubt that not only the International Financial Architecture Working Group, under its able leadership, where we are very much also, but embedded in the Troika principle, of which India, then Brazil, and South Africa would be integral components to it, would continue to add to the momentum of this process as we keep ourselves engaged to watch and monitor the progress in this complex agenda of reforming the international financial architecture. Much has been done, much remains to be done, and much more care and caution needs to really inform us and monitor the progress and the change which takes place over the next coming months. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I hand over now the mic to the Department of Economic Affairs for the second session, which is due. Thank you very much. I bring this session to a close.
Thank you very much to all the esteemed speakers for the insightful discussions. With this, we have come to a close of panel 1. We will be starting with panel 2 discussions in a few minutes. Thank you. Requesting everyone to please be seated.
WebEx Assistant is enabled to save audio highlights.
Requesting everyone to please be seated for the next session. Welcome back to the next session. Our next panel discussion addresses the topic of managing global debt vulnerabilities. Let me now invite President Mr. Lavish Bhandari, CSEP, to kindly join us on stage as the moderator for this session. Dr. Lavish Bhandari is President and a Senior Fellow at CSEP. Dr. Bhandari has published widely on subjects related to sustainable livelihoods, industrial, economic and social reforms in India. May I now welcome on our esteemed panelists for this session, as I take their names. OSD G20 and Su Sherpa G20 India Secretariat, Mr. Abhay Thakur. Senior Fellow CSEP, Ms. Renu Kohli. Distinguished Fellow CSEP, Mr. Anup Singh. Deputy Director, Strategy, Policy and Review, IMF, Mr. Mark Flanagan, who will be joining us virtually. Secretary General, Paris Club, Mr. Philip Duparet, who will be joining us virtually. Thank you all for joining us. I would now request President CSEP, Mr. Lavish Bhandari, to give his opening remarks and take forward the panel discussion. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Very warm welcome to this panel discussion on managing debt vulnerabilities, organized jointly by the Ministry of Finance and the Center for Social and Economic Progress. I am Lavish Bhandari, Senior Fellow and President from CSAP, and I would be the host for this session. Especially after the last session, it's quite evident that we are living in challenging times. Global public debt has been on the rise even before, in fact, much before the pandemic occurred. And it reached a record 92 trillion in 2022. Public debt has been increasing faster in developing countries compared to developed ones. The total public debt of developing countries in 2010 was about 35% of the GDP, which rose to about 60% by 2022. According to the UNCTAD, there were 45 developing countries with a debt-to-GDP ratio of above 60% in the year before the pandemic, and a number which rose to 59% by 2022. Poor countries that had insufficient budgetary resources sought external financing during the pandemic. Consequently, the level of public debt in general and external public debt in particular increased significantly. But there has also been a distinct shift in the character of the debt. In 2010, more than half of developing countries' external public debt was held by traditional creditors, which include the IMF, World Bank, the Paris Club. Over time, however, this has been increasing, and by 2021, this had, by the private creditors, had increased to 62%. The shift of these debt towards private creditors has made the debt profile difficult for debt restructuring and, of course, more expensive. Servicing such high levels of external public debt poses a major challenge for poor countries. Most of these poor countries are in the African region, facing unsustainable debt burdens. But they are, of course, not just limited to African regions, as we know from our own neighborhood. From 2010 to 2022, interest payments increased by approximately 64% for developing nations and by 132% for African countries. The growth of interest payments outweighs the growth in public expenditure on health, education, investment, which is becoming another major concern for developing economies. Debt sustainability analysis by the IMF suggests that as of August 2023, out of the 69 low-income countries, 10 countries are already in debt, 26 countries are at high risk, and 26 countries are at moderate risk, and 7 countries are at a low risk of debt distress. Almost all debt sustainability indicators of developing economies have deteriorated, particularly for least developed countries. It is important to have a comprehensive strategy to deliver relief to indebted countries, with responsibilities shared amongst all parties. This is necessary to restore long-term external debt sustainability in many LICs and LDCs, and to achieve the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. To discuss this important issue, we have a panel of 5 distinguished guests. Our first panelist is Professor Anup Singh, who is a distinguished fellow at CSEP and was a member of India's 15th Finance Commission. Among his previous positions, he had a long and illustrious career at the International Monetary Fund, where he held several important positions, including Director of the Asia Pacific Department, Director of the Western Hemisphere, and Director of the Special Operations in the Office of Managing Director. Anup Singh has taught at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. as an adjunct professor. At CSEP, his research focuses on themes of India's fiscal architecture, fiscal governance, and fiscal federalism. Professor Singh's recent publications include a book titled Asia and the Changing Global Economy, Rebuilding the Growth Potential. Our next panelist is Philippe Grion-Dupeha. He is the Secretary General of Paris Club, an informal group of official creditors whose role is to find coordinated and sustainable solutions to the payment difficulties experienced by debtor countries. He has spent 12 years at Trésor, previously head of cash management at Agence France Trésor, the French government debt agency, and used to cover the World Bank and African Development Bank, in particular the IDA and ADF funds. A third panelist is CSEP Senior Fellow Renu Kohli. She's an economist with research and practitioner experience on macroeconomic policies and issues. She has previously worked with the RBI, the IMF, and think tanks including ICRIER and the Institute of Economic Growth. Her work has focused on financial sector liberalization, capital flows, and exchange rate management in emerging markets. Our fourth panelist is Mr. Abhay Thakur. He worked with Hindustan Lever Limited before joining the Indian Foreign Service in 1992. He has served in various capacities in Indian missions in Moscow, London, Tel Aviv, Ho Chi Minh City, and as the High Commissioner of India to Mauritius and Nigeria. At Ministry of External Affairs, New Delhi, he worked as the Director in External Affairs Minister's Office and also as the Joint Secretary North. He assumed charge as Additional Secretary in charge of G20 in December 21 and thereafter as OSD G20 in September 23. The fifth panelist is Mr. Mark Flanagan. He's the Deputy Director of IMF Strategy, Policy and Review Department, where his duties include overseeing debt policy work with a particular focus on emerging markets. He joined the IMF in 1998, and his work on debt has included overseeing the most recent reviews of the fund's debt limit, policy and low-income country, and the market access country DSA frameworks, and the fund's work on debt transparency. Over the last 15 years, he has also led the IMF country work on Iceland, Greece, and the UK. This session is for 1 hour, and we have 5 panelists. I would request each panelist to take about 7-8 minutes for their remarks, so that we have at least 20 minutes for questions and answers. So may I request Mr. Anup Singh to please share his remarks. But I would like to just start off this whole discussion. Why is this problem still a problem? I mean, we've been suffering through the same set of arguments for the last, I think, more than 5 or 6 decades. If you could just give us some idea about why do these things sustain. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you very much, and thanks to the Ministry of Finance, to Ajay, Seth, and others for having arranged this. Before I start, maybe I'll add a point. I would expect and hope you're doing the same thing in other countries around the world, explaining India's view on many of these important issues. Luis, you asked me why are we still here, why are we here again? There are many aspects to this, and I think it's falls more on the side now of the IMF rather than the World Bank. The issue is we have a problem today with many countries in resolving their debt. In a perfect world, you would expect that the IMF would be a global lender of last resort that would ensure that countries that are financially constrained would have almost unimpeded access to liquidity. That is not the case because solving debt problems involves restructuring debt, and among the many issues involved currently, maybe until recently, the IMF has had a problem in that at least one shareholder, maybe more, have exercised an effective veto on the ability of the IMF to act. But that is dealing with the problem once it becomes a debt crisis. And Lavish, as you said, why be facing this problem across the world? It's not just emerging markets. We know what happened in 2008 with the United States. So before I talk about why that's the case, let me just briefly summarize what is being done right now by something called the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable that was set up earlier this year and has now made certain recommendations and conclusions. So what are they doing? They are emphasizing the importance to identify first and then try to restructure short-term debt. I say identify first and then restructure. To decide what are cut-off dates for certain debts, what are the arrears that countries have experienced and to whom? Are there contingent debt instruments that we don't know about? What about domestic debt? Where debt is concerned, it's not just external debt. Equally important is domestic debt, and that becomes part of the equation, as we've seen partly recently in Sri Lanka. And then you have, of course, state-owned enterprise debt. So what the roundtable is trying to do is before you start to restructure this and reach agreements, you've got to know what they are. So that is my main point. The underreporting of debt is a long-standing issue and is probably the primary cause of debt crises. You don't have to go back to Thailand in 1997 and the US in 2008. But the issue is, if you don't know what the debt is, you have a problem. The problem is not just you don't know what the debt is. The problem is that when crises arise, whichever the country, be it Thailand or United States or Sri Lanka, you see that their known debt is probably only a fraction of their real debt. We find out that the debts owed to commercial creditors and bilaterals also have been underreported, underfollowed, or understated. You also find that certain debt instruments, which are non-marketable and therefore not open to public view, they have also been subject to great underreporting. And the issue is, why is it that this underreporting, misreporting, or lack of reporting, which I see as a primary cause of where we are today, why is that the case? Now, earlier this afternoon, others spoke about the IMF's surveillance function. Surveillance is important because surveillance is supposed to try to ensure a crisis does not arise, especially of debt. As we look back into the history of countries over the last 20, 30 years, you find that when a crisis arises, in almost every case, there has been significant underreporting of borrowing and of debt. You also find out that there has been overstatement of growth. For example, before the Korean crisis in the late 1990s, Korea was thought it would grow that very year by 6%. So I'm saying there has been a problem over the years in surveillance. And I think that is where we need to focus on very much more carefully. Now, it's not just the fault of the country, which is, I think it primarily is. Certainly it was in the case of Thailand. It's also a fault of the IMF. So they are supposed to be the almost exclusive institution to do surveillance on the broad scale of macro, financial, and debt. So what we've seen over the years is almost every crisis has been accompanied by underreporting of debt and over-reporting of growth. And so what we need, therefore, is a much fairer surveillance. Now, people have said that the IMF should exercise much more surveillance in the systemically important countries and not just in countries that develop crises. Now, there are stories behind that. I won't go into that right now. But the US crisis is a very important one, and we can talk about that at a later time. But the issue is very clear. The issue today is to restructure debt of crisis countries, to build the role and ability of the IMF to do so, to make it an effective lender of last resort, which needs a lot of changes in the way things are done around the world. But much more important, and I think this is what we should focus on over the next 1 year, is look at the surveillance function of the IMF and see why is it that in almost every case there has developed a crisis and the general assessment has been after the crisis that the surveillance before that was grossly or somewhat insufficient to catch the problem. Now, this is a much deeper issue. For example, in the case of Thailand, I can tell you, as I was there, the crisis was known. The crisis was fully known by the IMF. The crisis was not revealed and not exposed because the IMF wrongly agreed not to talk about the crisis until there was an agreement with the country how to handle it. It didn't happen. The crisis exploded. So the issue what I'm putting to you here today, Ravish, and to Secretary Ajay Seth, is as you look ahead, we of course need to deal with cardinal debt crises in Sri Lanka and Zambia and all those, yes. But there will be crises 20 years from now which should not happen. And for that we need a much altered, much more substantive surveillance role, not only by the IMF, but also by other important international institutions and by the BIS. And I think our focus should be, first, yes, deal with the current problems, but look ahead over the next 20 years, so we're not in this situation every 10 years. That's my comment for this afternoon. Thank you very much.
And thank you for keeping to your 7.5 minutes. May I now next request our panelist, Philippe Dupeha, to make his initial comments. You may be muted. You may want to check your microphone.
Do you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay. Apologies. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the organizers of the meeting. So it's good to take the time to pause. So I will comment on 2 points, which are that the vulnerabilities have been building over the last decade and accentuated by the crisis in 22-23. But this point will be shorter, given the first a couple of comments you made. And second, I will emphasize the need for cooperation. First, high debt was in place when shocks happened in 2022. You mentioned the amount of debt for the low and middle income countries. And if you focus on the low income countries, the level is even more from 25 to. Sorry, there is an echo because I hear what I'm saying.
There is no echo here.
Because I hear the sound of the room.
Can you switch off the microphone on our side, please?
Yeah. Sorry.
Please go ahead.
Okay, sorry. Do you hear me well better? Yeah, that's no. Apologies for this. I try to go on. Right.
Yes, so please move on.
I was saying that the amount was quite big as debt, and that the financing needs are still very high, and when become higher in 22 and 23, we had now financing needs which are approximately 3% of GDP for domestic spending, compared to 5% approximately in 2019. And this leads to refinancing pressure. The bond market access is more challenging for the low-income countries. IMF reckons that redemptions are 6 billion for low-income countries in 2024 and 2025. But that said, the solvency and liquidity indicators are significantly stronger than before HIPC initiative. So according to the IMF, the trend should stay for between 7 to 10 years before reaching effectively HIPC level. So switching to my second point, which is probably more important, it's about the need for cooperation. We had a shift in the debt composition. And basically, if you take the low-income countries, before HIPC and compared to now, Paris Club a share of the debt was divided into four. New creditors, and mainly China, new G20 creditors, including China, were three times bigger, and private creditors are approximately 2.4 times bigger than before HIPC. And how does that make things more complicated to restructure? I would say it is fairly more complicated, but not unachievable. And I think that we have a good experience in that regard. I will take two perspectives. I would say it's not as straightforward as it used to be, but I can take two perspectives, be it on the debtor side or on the creditor side. On the debtor side, having a number of creditor makes it much harder for the debtor because he needs to engage with a number of creditors. And he needs to ensure this sort of consistency in the treatment, which is probably more difficult for him. On the creditor side, it's the same process and the same objective. We still need to fill the gap, the financing gap that the IMF, which is a third trust party, with doing the independent analysis, he's contemplating. So we have this engagement between the IMF and its shareholders to reach the terms which will be sufficient to fill the gap. And here we had innovative solutions. So you have the case of the common framework, which allowed to have solutions for Chad or for Zambia. And of course, it takes more time than it used to take when you have just a Paris Club, because as we are more creditors around the table, and as we are taking new decisions together, it takes more time, and also because we're starting, but we need to recognize that these were good agreements for the borrower, which delivered a result. It is also the case outside the common framework. Based on the cooperation we had inside the common framework, we were able to set ad hoc coordination for Sri Lanka, with probably a possibility to have results also for Sri Lanka. I will say another word on private creditors. On private creditors, we have different preferences between both. Usually, public creditors, official creditors, bring new money through the IMF or through their bilateral lending. And we want to protect multilateral creditors, and we have the preferred creditor status because they are providing the new money in general. And private creditors usually are more sensitive to the recovery value, so they are ready to take a haircut, but to be repaid more quickly. So it's a balance between being repaid more quickly or in the longer term compared to being repaid further in time. And we can make the common framework work better. We had a number of proposals, and the first distinguished speaker spoke about the GSDR and the proposal which have been discussed there. We are in favor of, for instance, guidelines or time more constraint for taking the terms. And speaking of time constraints, I will leave it here and be happy to go on the discussion afterwards.
So there is a problem, and we started the session by saying that why is this a problem, and focused mainly the role or the lab of IMF survey. But I'm going to focus now that on the Okay, all right. Does that work? Okay, so yeah, I'm going to focus upon the fact that there is a problem and what is being done about it and what can be done. Um, Not that I have a solution really, but there are some features that stand out, and perhaps it's important that the G20 and the multilateral cooperation may focus upon that, could focus upon that. So the good thing is that there is a mechanism which is the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable, GSDR. And very briefly to say that why is the extant mechanism to resolve sovereign debt in the past, which were never easy to start with at any point in time, but there was a mechanism, and there still is, the Paris Club. But now that isn't working anymore because the set of creditors are completely different, and they happen to be all non-Paris Club members, with disproportionate weight of China, which is the largest, which has emerged as the largest bilateral official creditor in the last 1.5 decades, primarily to the low income and the middle income countries. So that's the issue. The issue regarding debt owed to such creditors are very many, and summarily there is not incomplete information about it. There's incomplete burden sharing. There is intransigence in resolution on patterns that have been adopted in the past. On the side of private creditors, the heterogeneities are far too many. So all in all, there are many, many problems, particularly the demands or the preference hierarchies that the way resolutions have happened in the past is that the multilateral development banks take no haircuts. But there are countries and there are creditors which say there should be equality on all sides, and China's insistence upon MDBs taking haircuts. So these are the issues which are being taken up in the GSDR, which is a forum set up by the G20, and it's a good sign because there are structural changes in the world, and particularly as far as debt resolution is concerned, and it's important to acknowledge that and move ahead. In time, one hopes that it will become a kind of another Paris Club, if not Paris Club itself, on the basis of agreed principles amongst all the stakeholders. Now, some of the issues are fairly straightforward, and I think there should not be a problem by all the countries to agree to it, which is that the standards, norms, principles surrounding debt, let's call them the Paris Club principles. These are nothing extraordinary. These are pretty standard all over the world. You'll find them in contracts within individual parties, in financial markets, in informal markets, informal ones. You'll find them across countries. You'll find them in private financial, global financial markets. So there should not be a problem in 20 countries at least agreeing to those, which are to do with in full disclosure, information sharing, burden sharing also. But then the burden sharing leads to a problem, which is, again, which I mentioned, is the MDBs and the private creditors. So over there, the second point is the multilateral development banks. Now, there is a reason why the Bretton Woods institutions were set up, and for them to take haircuts and lose their ratings or the senior creditor or preferred creditor status directly undermines or diminishes the ability on the World Bank's part to raise low-cost financing, and on the IMF's part, there could be an issue about the IMF's role is, one of its roles is to also provide a global financial safety net, and it could be undermining global financial stability to an extent if that's what started happening. Not that in the past there have not been debt relief initiatives, but those have been exceptions, like the HIPC and the MDRI, and I'll just come to that in a second. But before that, I'd like to highlight the third thing, which is the third stakeholder, which is the private creditors, bondholders. There are elements that I think that ought to figure in the discussions amongst, particularly at the GSDR, which are to do with history. Historically, the private creditors have got off the most lightly. There is research done by Mayor Horn and Tribesh and Reinhardt on the, sovereign debt since Waterloo. But essentially, it calculates the median haircuts, which has been under 50%. The returns on external sovereign bonds in over 2 centuries, and let me focus on the last bit, which is the 1995 to 2016. The average return on real returns have been about 7%, all countries. The serial defaulters even higher, because the premium or the coupon on issuing the debt on external foreign currency bonds is much higher. Real returns, they've been on average about 4 to 6% above UK and US bonds. So it's not that the private bondholders have ever really lost out, and they have taken historically. So that's one element that ought to figure in the discussions at some point in time. The second is the trajectory. There has, over the last 3 decades, and both Lavish and Anup referred to these debt waves which come like sort of every decade, which is true. There has been a progression towards greater concessionality in restructurings over the last 20 years, particularly to last 2 decades, 80s and the 90s. That has gone hand in hand, coincidentally or incidentally, as it were, with increasing progression of proliferation of private bond markets, private financial markets, deregulation, private bondholders. So there is a problem over there. And that's something that ought to be studied or examined in detail, if at all it matters, in bringing around convergence. The third is, the fourth one is, and I will end there, I know I'm overshooting, which is that now there is a problem and we need to get out of it. Would the G20 consider another debt relief initiative on the lines of HIPC? There has been a Brady Plan 2.0 being suggested by Lou Bickett and who are debt specialists, and that's something that can be figured out, provided there are backstop clauses to prevent such incidents or serial defaulter countries from going this passage again in another decade or so. Thank you.
Thank you, Renu, for some very provocative remarks, and we must later have a debate between Monsieur Dupeha and yourself, but that's for later. Mr. Ajay, can I request you to, it would be nice if you can hear, but you're welcome to use that if you want to.
Respected Secretary Economic Affairs, Mr. Lavish Bhandari. I'm not a finance expert, but what I will try to dwell upon is to share my understanding, the achievements of the G20 on the subject of global debt vulnerability and some of my own diplomatic experience. I think firstly it is very important for India to clearly define the problem for all of us, break it down. There are many, many parts to this problem, but and then really see how the international community can address it. We have reported figures of 92 trillion US dollars as global public debt. What we are really addressing in the G20 as the key focus is the external public debt from bilateral and multilateral creditors of about 50 low and middle income countries under the common framework. So that is, it's very important to have laser focus on the problem that we are tackling. For the time being, while we do not shut our eyes to it, we are excluding domestic debt, developed countries' debt, private external debt, etc. And that is necessary to be effective. There are several, strands to this problem. And we also cannot lose sight of the achievement of SDGs while we are addressing this challenge. Now, in the current scenario, in the very difficult, period that geopolitical tensions, I think our presidency achieved a whole lot. Despite divergences, and we cannot forget the Bali leaders' declaration, where the footnote, the only one footnote in the Bali declaration was on this issue. India very quickly in its presidency in February this year could bring about broad consensus on this very complex subject. Thereafter, the global sovereign debt roundtable was established, debt treatment to at least 3 countries were, made progress: Zambia, Ghana, and Ethiopia. And Sri Lanka was also widely acknowledged. So what I'm trying to say is, given the very, deeply divided scenario, a lot of progress was achieved in this very complex area. From the external affairs perspective, I would like to add an important subject. I think we sometimes might tend to lose sight of it, which is the quality and transparency of international development cooperation. Now, that's a very critical component. We cannot skirt around it when we are talking about global development, debt vulnerabilities. What we could achieve in the G20 presidency, for example, in the foreign ministers meeting, was a very clear consensus on development cooperation, where we said that development cooperation should be guided by the principle of equal partnerships, country ownership, tailored to national, regional, and local needs and circumstances, and underscored the need for addressing financing gap towards implementation of 2030 agenda, while noting the importance of transparency and mutual accountability. I mean, this is very important, and green transition and economic development needs to go hand in hand. So therefore, and we also saw India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, the Partnership for Global Infrastructure. Major development cooperation initiatives are coming into play as, the world economy grows. I mean, the share of emerging economies in G20 has grown from about 28% to 40% since G20 was founded. So this is the size of global economy. As it grows, this problem will also grow, and therefore we must also squarely bring in developmental cooperation into the agenda. Overall, we also saw that, the financing needs of scaling up from billions to trillions, whether it is development finance or climate finance, clearly came in. Bigger, better, more effective, and more representative MDBs came in. And in this context, better project management, financial management. One of the speakers before me spoke about the need to know how much the debt is. And it is therefore also important to know how much is the return of the project in which you are making. I mean, you cannot have a hydropower plant or a road building investment which is, X in India and 5X or 10X in Africa. That's not correct. Even if you know how much it is, you have to also have a very good project management and financial management skills. So overall, I'll conclude by saying that while tackling the underlying economic debt problems, all of this requires a plethora of measures, financial and also, broadly sectoral, sector-specific, which is important in each sector. And we have to tackle this challenge in different ways and see how far we can go. The presidency of India has had significant achievement, number of major commitments, and I think with the support of relevant financial institutions in the long term, and also debt relief initiatives in the short run, in the Troika period, India, Brazil, and South Africa, we are determined to continue this journey, pursue greater and more vigorous multilateralism to bring about, greater focus on this issue of global debt and take forward what has been achieved this year. Thank you.
Thank you. Now may I request Mark Flanagan to share his remarks. You're the last panelist, but you bring forth the view from IMF, and we started this session with the IMF's with an assignment of blame and responsibility on IMF. So it would be really nice to hear your views on this. And after this, I'm going to go do another round with the panelists in case they have some questions of each other, and then I'm going to throw it open to the audience for their questions. But we will close this at about 7:15. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? As an initial remark, let me thank the organizers for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm sorry I can't be there in person with everybody. So let me try to give you what I would call sort of the canonical view at the IMF of debt vulnerabilities and where we stand. Many of you would have heard us talk about high risk of debt distress. And I think an earlier speaker mentioned a little over half of low income and developing countries are considered to either be in debt distress or at high risk of debt distress. So what does this mean? Because I think this is a number that is often misinterpreted. And I can tell you what it means as I developed the framework that generated those numbers. What it means is that what it means, first of all, is high risk is a high risk of entering either a liquidity or a solvency crisis, either of them. So it doesn't mean a country's going bankrupt. It just means it's going to experience a debt distress event. And it's defined over a future 5-year window. And if I look at the hazard rate over that 5-year window, it's going to be in the range of 15 to 25% of the cases that are in high risk that will lapse into such a crisis. Now, if I do the math on that, there are about 70 low-income and developing countries. If I do the math on that, that means between 3 and 7 over the next 5 years. Strictly speaking, that's what the math suggests. Now, that is not a systemic debt crisis by any means, right? Certainly, we've already got some countries in debt distress. They are being resolved more quickly now than they were a year and a half ago, but they are being resolved. And another 3 to 7 seems manageable. That is not what anybody would define as a systemic debt crisis, nothing like the 1990s when in the run-up to HIPC. However, that's our baseline. There are really important risk scenarios that we need to follow closely. The one I want to highlight for you, and which relates directly to debt dynamics, for those of you who follow debt issues in economics, you know that debt dynamics are driven by the difference between the real interest rate and the real growth rate, R minus G, as people speak of. And the risk scenarios relate to a sustained shock to this difference between real interest rates and growth. And they're real risk scenarios. It's not hard to generate scenarios over the next decade that see a sustained rise in real interest rates and a sustained fall in growth around the world. Why? Well, continued loose fiscal policy in advanced economies is going to drive up real interest rates for a sustained period of time. Now, we don't expect that in the baseline, but I think everybody here can appreciate why that's a important risk scenario. And at the same time, sustained high real interest rates will suppress global growth, in particular through commodity market channels. To an extent, that is what happened in the 1980s when we had a debt crisis. So that's an important risk scenario that's out there. All right, so if it's not a systemic debt crisis that we're in or expecting, what is going on? And I think I would sum it up this way. It's a crisis of financing. Private and Chinese commercial lending is way down over the last 3 years. Now, the MDBs have increased their lending, which is somewhat compensating. But on the borrower side, we have accelerating needs, right? They're trying to meet the SDGs. They're having to deal with climate adaptation. They're having to deal with a higher interest bill. I think the moderator nicely summed it up when he made comparisons of the interest bill to health and other social spending. So there is a crisis of financing that's squeezing budgets. The problem with that is that liquidity issues of that type can morph into solvency problems. You know, there's a bit of a conundrum here, right? So if these countries are solvent, why won't the private sector lend to them? Because that's what's happening. The private sector is pulled back dramatically. There are reasons for this. There's uncertainty, of course. There can be problems with seniority structure in individual countries' debt structure. Creditors don't lending into uncertainty where there's a debt structure that leans towards highly senior debt, meaning that if there is a problem, they will bear all the costs. So there are reasons why we see this, but the underlying problem is you could end up with in a bad equilibrium where a high risk premium imposed by the private sector, a high real interest rate, essentially destabilizes the debt dynamics in these countries and creates questions about solvency. So that problem sits out there. It needs to be solved. Now, how? You know, people have been putting options on the table, scaled up MDB lending. I've even heard proposals for a new debt service suspension initiative, a new DSSI. However, you know, there are limits to what MDBs can do with the present level of capital. plus, we need to remember that too much super senior debt could impair market access going forward. And at the end of the day, we know from the numbers that a lot of these low-income and developing countries will need to rely on market sources of finance. The other route, in fact, in some sense, it's an opposite of forcing the private sector to stay in through another DSSI. Well, we know that route is extremely unpopular with borrowers. At the time the original DSSI was conceived of, and I was the person at the IMF handling that, we had massive resistance from borrowing countries to extending it to PSI, or private sector involvement. They were worried about their ratings, they were worried about their future market access, etc. And we would have seen, if there had been a private sector component to that, we would have seen a lot fewer countries actually take it up. There is that much resistance to that. So what are the key issues here then for countries to deal with in this kind of environment? Or for, I should say, for all stakeholders. So let me say, you know, a key issue for donors is grants. You know, if you have, by definition, right, if you have debt sustainability risks, you don't want to load extra debt. If you have a debt structure that's leaning too super senior already, and you're going to count on market access going forward, you can't load it too much more. So grants is a key issue, scaling up grants. For countries themselves, it's actually extremely important to improve their revenue collection. Many of these low-income countries have very limited revenue collection, quite a bit of opportunity to raise it. Now, the reasons for that, they have oftentimes weak tax administrations, complicated by the fact that they have large tax expenditures, tax exemptions, etc., and the two interact, right? So there's an issue there. But domestic resource mobilization also means building up domestic savings and borrowing on domestic markets and trying to enhance prospects to borrow domestically. All told, this would make countries a lot more creditworthy. Final thing I want to mention for policymakers to focus on is improving restructuring processes. And this is for policymakers globally. A number of speakers have touched on this. Some countries will face problems with debt restructuring, even though we don't see a systemic crisis. There are enough out there that we need to deal with this. And we must do better than the long timeline seen to date in dealing with these issues. So we need creditors' internal processes to improve. We need creditor coordination mechanisms to improve. Sorry? Can I finish my list of 4 things?
Yeah. So you said 3 things. You missed the 4th one.
So we need creditor coordination mechanisms to improve. That's the role of the GSDR, which is out there to revive consensus on technical issues. We need to strengthen DSA frameworks and make them more available. That's something for the IMF to do. And we need some adjustments to IMF policies to promote our earlier engagement. Thank you very much.
May I now request if any of the panelists have any comment or intervention, a quick one, please. Philippe, would you have any comment or last, any intervention or any response to any of the panelists' comments? No. Okay. So I'm going to take 3 questions. Okay, the gentleman at the back, gentleman here.
Yeah.
Person there. Okay.
I have a question for Mr. Flanagan. See, you have been in Greece as well as Iceland, 2 of the developed economies which have had a credit crisis. India.
So please make the question short.
Okay, the question is, there is excessive capital in Europe and in the developed economies, but it doesn't really see its way to the extent it should into developing countries like India. For instance, you invest in 0% bonds in Europe, in the European Central Bank, but a lot of this could come into Indian infrastructure and other developing countries. Why do you think this capital is so reluctant to make its way here? Thank you.
Thank you.
you want me to answer, or do you want to collect questions?
We are just collecting the questions first, and then we'll go for the answers later.
Thank you, Lavishji. My question is also to Mr. Flanagan. I just wanted to bring his attention to the China factor. Recently, there were news that two developments. One is developing countries owe China over $1 trillion in debt, and the other thing is China itself has its own local debt problem with over 23 trillion. And recently, we have seen. My question
focus on the question, please.
Yes, my question is: IMF had recently visited China and sought its help to make sure that IMF is at the center of this global safety net. So I wanted to ask Mr. Flanagan on how he sees China's role in with the substantial debt problem, both from the developing country side and also domestically.
Thank you. The gentleman there.
My question is to Dr. Renu Kohli. The question is in the context of this argument that these vulnerabilities of developing countries, to what extent it is getting exacerbated with the growing environmental concerns coupled with the food and fuel crisis, because it's dragging it further from countries like Zambia and so on. But along with it, may I also ask that what would your take be on a set of hedge funds, etc., basically entering into the market of this broken bonds of Zambia sort of countries, and that in itself being utilized towards making larger gains, though there is large civil society resistance against it in different developed countries also in this.
Thank you. May I request Mr. Flanagan to respond? But then, if anyone else wants to respond to those questions and from the panel, you're welcome to as well.
Okay, quickly. Why does capital flow to developing countries? Why doesn't it flow to developing countries? This is a good question. So, in a nutshell, it's risk, right? Plus deficiencies in the global financial safety net. So in the context of global financial safety net deficiencies, what that means is you've got a strong bias from a lot of countries to hold low interest bonds as reserves in global financial capitals. And a lot of, in the context of avoidance of risk, and I include in that category residents in low income and developing countries who constitute flight capital to escape domestic risk of expropriation. High risk essentially channels that money towards low interest earning assets. And they're overcoming that is about a complicated set of reforms in a lot of low income and developing countries to reduce risk, but it can be done. But I do want to also note that it's not like it doesn't flow, right? Oftentimes it does flow a little bit too rapidly, in particular after the wake of HIPC, right? There was a huge flow of private capital to a lot of these low income and developing countries because HIPC had reduced their risk, their sovereign risk notably. And that has not ended well, unfortunately. The money hasn't been used well, which underscores the inherent risk. Now, China, you mentioned an interesting facet of the China issue, which is they loaned a lot of money domestically into real estate, mainly, and externally. I'm going to describe this as a political economy problem for them. And it creates issues for them internally, right? So we know China needs to recognize the losses that are already there on external lending. But in a political economy sense, this is very difficult to do for them in that, they also have a lot of overextended and over-indebted residents who are there, and they have to potentially address in some way as well. So, they've got both issues. They have to work on both. They have some political economy issues, but they are moving. And I do want to emphasize that. They are moving to address external debt problems. We've had a lot of progress over the last year and a half from China in addressing Zambia, Sri Lanka, and, their ongoing ongoing discussions now about Suriname, Ghana, and Ethiopia. So there's a lot of progress with China. I think Philippe would agree with that versus the period of 2 years ago, and we hope to see more of that. So I do have to commend them for their efforts in the last while to find a way to work with the international system. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. You're right, of course, as far as the countries which were already vulnerable or have less capacity, less financial capacity, their debt has been aggravated, this situation, by the pandemic first, and then the aftershocks of the pandemic, which is the inflation and the food and fuel shocks that have followed the pandemic. So you know, that's why we have this wave of defaults over debt or impending defaults. And the fact is that full repudiation of debt is very rare, and countries insist on repaying. So what happens is that the casualty is growth. And when growth falters and interest rates have moved up, inflation is higher, the debt dynamics, as Mark Flanagan pointed out, it only worsens. So one of the things is that all the stakeholders know this, which is, you know, whether the bilateral creditors, the private bondholders, and the MDBs, all the stakeholders in this debt resolution or debt restructuring mechanism, they know that the market dynamics is only, or the debt dynamics is only going to get worse further and further. And if a country's credit worthiness goes down, then the spreads widen. And so at the end of the day, the take away from a restructuring with a haircut and with any kind of rescheduling or interest rate reprieves, which is usually part of a restructuring deal, is a better deal than a no deal or facing a country's default. So that's the situation that currently is in. And as Mark also pointed out, there's a lot of progression, and despite all this intransigence, China has participated in the restructurings, 4 of them, and it continues to do so, which is what to say that it's not, all is not lost or there's hope. One could say that there is too little and too slow.
Thank you. Any, yeah.
My simple point is just one. There is the issue of why. But before we get to why you borrowed, the fundamental 101 is every country has to make debt reporting transparent and publicly available. Unless we do that for domestic debt as well as external debt, we're going to continue to have debt crises. That's my only point. Make it transparent and make it publicly available every quarter.
Thank you. So I must thank all the panelists. Philippe, you had a point?
Yes, but if you
Go ahead. I was just told I can steal a few seconds, so it's okay.
Sorry, thank you. I just wanted to comment on what has been said. So first on the question of excessive capital in developed countries and why it flow to medium and low-income countries. My point would be that when the interest rate in 2022 and 2023, there was an outflow from emerging markets to advanced economy markets. So you see that the interest rate is a core component of these. And as mentioned, most countries, sorry, we still have this eco issue. Sorry. So I was saying that there was an outflow on the one hand, and on the other hand, while being in the income or medium income countries, you had the issue of increasing debt service or interest charges which have increased from, if I remember well, 10 to 23% in NIC countries between 2010 and 2023. So you have this issue of interest rates and the issue of global inflation, of course. Second, I would comment on the third distinguished panelist who said that we had time for another HIPIC, and I would recommend all attendees to read the excellent working paper by the IMF about how we're heading for a new HIPC or something like this. Mark, I'm probably quoting it badly, but which is a clear picture of the situation. And from my perspective, being a Ministry of Finance official also, this costed 120 billions for donors. So it was split between donors direct lending and then donors compensating through MDRI, Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative. But this was $120 billion for the donors. So the question for officials and for politics is: are we able to support another HIPIC initiative? Plus, if you put on the borrower side, if you have this kind of debt cancellation, it makes it very hard to finance them and to refinance those countries. While, as Mark rightly pointed out, there was a number of needs, big needs for financing the transition. So this is an important point. And I'm just finishing with the third point about sound policies. So Mark spoke about domestic resource mobilization. So to have in mind that in Sub-Saharan Africa, we have 15% of tax collection compared to GDP, which is very low. And so we need to have a shift also to more formal, from informal to formal economy, and to reduce also the level of subsidies, which can be very high. And you probably have in mind fuel and food subsidies, which make the bulk of it. So 3 comments. Thank you very much.
So with this, this session is closed, and I must thank the panelists, both who have joined virtually and those present here. This has been an amazing session, very thought-provoking, and it could have led to some arguments as well, but unfortunately we didn't have enough time. I did try to get one going, but unfortunately that didn't work. But really, this has been a unique session. It's the first time that I have come across where the Ministry of Finance has so intimately worked with think tanks and been present all through. I must thank the Ministry of Finance people who have been proactive, very quick to respond, and very flexible. It's not easy to put together a panel such as this and a group such as this, and really congratulations to you all. The second, I would like to thank ICRIER and my team at CSET for working together on this. This is a very important topic, and I hope these conversations continue. They do feed in to the research process in ways that many times we don't understand. But the kind of insights that some of us have benefited from are truly invaluable. So once again, thank you everyone for being here, and thanks, and I hope to see some more of this. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all the esteemed speakers for the insightful discussions. With this, we come to conclusion of today's seminar. Thank you very much for your participation. IT has been arranged at Nalanda in the ground floor. Would request everyone to kindly join. Thank you so much once again.